Okay, here's what we actually know. Number 8. The Man in the Ice. It was a completely ordinary September day in 1991. Helmut and Erika Simon were hiking through the Ötztal Alps, about 10,500 feet above sea level, when something brownish caught their eye, poking out of the glacier ice. Their first instinct was reasonable enough. A discarded doll, maybe, or possibly a hiker who'd recently had a very bad day up there. Either would have been unpleasant. Either would have made sense. This didn't make sense. Carbon-14 dating by the University of Innsbruck placed the body at around 3,300 BC, over 5,300 years old. Konrad Spindler, the lead archaeologist on the case, called it a sensation of the first order. That sounds like the kind of thing scientists aren't supposed to say, but when you understand what he was looking at, it's hard to argue. Here's the thing about remains from this era. They're almost always skeletal. Bones, maybe teeth if you're lucky, and that's about it. Ötzi had been completely mummified by the glacier. Skin, organs, clothing, tools. Even his last meal was still there. He had a copper axe on his belt, and an arrow lodged in his shoulder blade. He wasn't just a body. He was a frozen crime scene, one we've been investigating for over 5,000 years. And unlike most mysteries this old, we can actually sequence his entire genome, which, as it turns out, does not make things simpler. Number 7. Not from where he was found. When Albert Zink and his team at Iraq Research in Bolzano published Ötzi's first high-resolution genome in 2012, the assumption was straightforward. His DNA should match local Copper Age populations from the Alps. Alpine hunters, early farmers from the region, maybe a blend of both, whatever you'd expect from someone who lived and died in those mountains. What they found matched none of that. Ötzi's DNA traced back primarily to the Anatolian Neolithic farmer lineage, a group from what is now Turkey, that began spreading westward around 7,000 BC. On its own, that wouldn't be shocking, because most Copper Age Europeans carried a mix of that Anatolian farmer ancestry and Western hunter-gatherer DNA. Genetic blending was the norm. That's what I'd expect from pretty much anyone of this period. But Ötzi was almost exclusively Anatolian. The Western hunter-gatherer line, which was everywhere around him, barely shows up in his genome at all. The study, published in Nature Communications, compared his genome against over 5,000 modern Europeans. His closest genetic matches? Sardinians and Corsicans, Mediterranean islanders whose populations stayed relatively isolated for centuries. Geographically, about as far from the Alps as you can get, while still being in Europe. His DNA described a sedentary farmer from the Mediterranean world. His body was found alone in the mountains, carrying a copper axe and hunting gear, miles from any cultivated field. Number 6. The farmer who didn't farm. A quick step back, because this needs context. The Anatolian farmer ancestry traces to the Neolithic Revolution, when people in Anatolia first domesticated wheat, barley, sheep, and goats, roughly 10,000 years ago, then gradually moved west, bringing agriculture with them. Johannes Krause, director of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, has spent years mapping these migration waves, and the pattern is pretty consistent. Wherever Anatolian farmers arrived in Europe, they mixed with the local hunters and gatherers who were already there. Modern Europeans carry DNA from both groups. Ötzi's genome looks as though that process simply never happened for his ancestors. Almost no Western hunter-gatherer DNA. His lineage arrived in Europe and stayed genetically untouched by everyone already living there. Genetically, 100% farmer, rooted in sedentary, grain-based agriculture by ancestry. And yet, here he is, trekking through the high Alps with a bow and a copper axe. I can't quite square those two pictures, and I suspect that's actually the point. Number 5. The diseases written into his genes. In 2016, Frank Meixner and his team at Iraq screened Ötzi's tissue for pathogenic DNA, looking for traces of disease agents that might still be detectable after 5 millennia. What they found was more extensive than anyone expected. pulled directly from his tissue samples, DNA, from Borrelia burgdorferi, the bacterium that causes Lyme disease. That makes Ötzi the oldest confirmed case of Lyme disease in human history, most likely picked up from a tick bite somewhere in the alpine landscape. A disease that, in 5,300 years, has apparently not changed its habits much. On top of that, his genome carried genetic markers for cardiovascular disease, alleles associated with coronary artery calcification. CT scans confirmed advanced arteriosclerosis, which would have made climbing to 10,000 feet genuinely brutal on his body. And then there's the detail I find almost impossibly ironic. Ötzi was lactose intolerant. This man descended from farmers whose entire way of life was built around domesticating animals, goats, sheep, cattle, and he couldn't digest their milk. Sometimes history has a sense of humor. Number 4. The diet that doesn't add up. Klaus Oegel, a botanist at the University of Innsbruck, spent years reconstructing the contents of Ötzi's stomach. Pollen grains, plant fibers, protein residues, anything still identifiable. What he pieced together: dried red deer meat, ibex fat, einkorn wheat, traces of bracken fern, high calorie, high fat, high protein, the kind of food you don't throw together on a whim, but deliberately prepare when you know things are going to get physically demanding. What makes this interesting is the contrast with his genetic profile. Ötzi's ancestry, pure Anatolian Neolithic farmer, is biologically optimized for a grain-heavy diet shaped by thousands of years of agriculture. That's baked into his DNA. His stomach was full of wild game. His genes said grain. His body ran on hunting. And what that tells us about the actual living conditions of his community, 5,000 years on, we can only very cautiously guess at. Number 3. The riddle of the last meal. In 2018, Frank Meixner published a follow-up study in Current Biology using high-resolution proteomics, a method that identifies individual proteins in tissue samples, giving an even more precise picture of what was actually there. The results sharpened what was already known: red deer, dried or smoked; ibex fat from alpine wild goats; einkorn wheat, domesticated and milled, meaning someone grew it and ground it before it somehow made its way to Ötzi; bracken fern. This meal was consumed roughly 2 hours before his death. The meat had been dried, preserved for travel, not freshly cooked. The fat content was unusually high, over 50% of total mass, which reads like survival rations, like the food of someone who knows things are about to get hard. Whether he had any idea what was coming, we can't say. But he ate like someone who wasn't planning on a second chance. Number 2. The living relatives. In 2013, Walter Parson and his team at the Medical University of Innsbruck analyzed Ötzi's Y chromosome. The genetic marker passed from father to son, largely unchanged across generations. They placed him in haplogroup GL91, then compared that marker against living populations in the Tyrolean region, the same mountains where Ötzi died. They found 19 living men in Austria carrying the exact same haplogroup. Direct patrilineal descendants, father to son, unbroken, across roughly 200 generations. The genetic thread Ötzi left behind ran through the entire span of human history that followed, and never snapped. That's one of the harder things in this story for me to fully process. Some part of him is still there, in the same mountains, 5,300 years later. At the same time, his mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, is completely absent from modern populations. That line died out at some point. When, why, and under what circumstances, we can no longer say. Number 1. The ancestry that rewrites everything. In 2023, K. Wang, K. Prüfer, Johannes Kraus, and their team at the Max Planck Institute published a new whole genome sequence of Ötzi at 30 times coverage, the highest resolution ever produced for him. And what came out of it wasn't a refinement of the existing picture. It was the uncomfortable realization that the picture had been incomplete from the start. Ötzi's genome is over 92% pure Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry. Western hunter-gatherer DNA is barely detectable, almost non-existent. For context, most Copper Age Europeans at that time were a genetic blend of roughly 60% Anatolian farmer and 40% Western hunter-gatherer. That was the established model, the baseline. When I first read that number, my genuine first thought was that there had to be an error somewhere in the dataset. There wasn't. The paper, published in Cell Genomics, lays out two possible explanations. Either Ötzi's population was part of a very early migration wave out of Anatolia, one that reached Europe before the mixing with Western hunter-gatherers had even begun, and then stayed genetically isolated in a geographically remote region for a long time after. Or, and this is the more unsettling possibility, there were multiple migration waves we simply didn't know about because we've been analyzing skeletal remains almost exclusively from regions with heavy genetic mixing, and isolated populations were disappearing into the noise of that data. If that's right, and the data makes a strong case that it is, then we've been describing the settlement of Europe with the wrong model. Not one wave of Anatolian farmers spreading evenly across the continent and blending with local hunters. Multiple groups, moving at different times, along different routes, isolated to varying degrees, some so cut off from the rest that without a randomly melting glacier, we'd almost certainly never have found them. Ötzi is the proof that one of those groups existed. A genetic island, frozen on a mountain pass, and we still don't know how many others are out there waiting. Ötzi was found by pure chance. A glacier melted, a hiker spotted something in the ice, and suddenly we had a population that didn't fit any existing model, a genetic island in the middle of the Alps, telling us that the story of how Europe was settled is considerably more layered than we thought. How many more groups like this are still out there? Frozen, buried, locked inside ice that's slowly melting? We genuinely don't know. And the next time you get a DNA test, just keep in mind, you might be more closely related to a 5,300-year-old murder victim than to the person sitting right next to you.